Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining our JCU webinar series. My name is Jack Rowden and I work as the Alumni Relations and Development Coordinator with JCU. So I'd like to pass on a big thank you to those alumni amongst the audience for joining us in this session tonight. I look forward to moderating this webinar. However, before we continue, I wish to acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of this country, and I pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders, past and present, of the land on which we stand today. In the spirit of reconciliation, I also acknowledge the valuable contribution that Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continue to make to James Cook University and the broader community. Now, this webinar is the latest in a series where we invite our top researchers and academics to share their expertise with the local community outside the lecture theatre. Tonight, we will be exploring the opportunities for social enterprise in far North Queensland. Dr. Narayan Gopalkrishnan is our speaker tonight. However, before I introduce him in earnest, just some housekeeping. If you do have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. I'll be monitoring this function throughout the presentation and I'll raise your questions with Narayan whenever appropriate. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce our sole speaker this evening, Dr. Narayan Gopalkrishnan, who is a senior lecturer in social work in the College of Arts, Society and Education, as well as a research fellow at the Cairns Institute and founding chair of the Social Enterprise Network for the Tropics. Narayan has compiled a 30-year career in Australia and overseas, working in universities. So this has included major development projects and large corporate entities in India and work in the not-for-profit sector and academia in Australia. Narayan brings extensive experience in international development in Asia and has managed significant research projects in rural development. Tonight, we are thrilled to have him enlighten us on the opportunities for social enterprise in far North Queensland. So over to you, Narayan.
Okay, now, Jack, thank you so much. But I would also like to acknowledge, I recognize that we are meeting from various places all over Australia. So I would like to certainly acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands that on which we are meeting, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and also pay my respects to the elders present at this time today at this webinar. Now today, despite that little hiccup, I'd like to share with you some of my thoughts about opportunities for social enterprises in far North Queensland. Now, when I was looking at the registration list yesterday, I saw there's a really diverse range of people in the audience. So I might have to cover some really basic things about social enterprise, as well as talk about their applications to the far North Queensland context. So in terms of the structure of today, I'll start with the context of far North Queensland, talk about some of the impacts of COVID-19 in the present day. I'll also talk about some of the basics of social enterprise and where the opportunities are. And from there, I'll actually take you to some of the research that we're currently doing in social enterprise in this space. And I'd like to acknowledge Professor Harriet Babacan, as well as Dr. Crystal Williams, who are involved in that research too, as well as Associate Professor Josephine Price and Associate Professor Taha Chechi. From there, I'll take you to the kinds of responses that we are doing at this present point in time, in terms of building networks, in terms of capacity building in the region. And I certainly would like to acknowledge the development of the social enterprise network for the Tropics, and also acknowledge the steering committee members who are part of the group today here, including Stephen Ang and Christine Doan. I'd also like to acknowledge Elise Parups of the Queensland Social Enterprise Council, who has been very supportive of our work. The QSEC has worked with us consistently for the last couple of years and has enabled us towards building the capacity in our region too. So we live in one of the most beautiful parts of the world. As a migrant to this country 20 years ago, I have seen many parts of the world, and I certainly do believe that far North Queensland is one of the most beautiful as well as most unspoiled areas in the world. Next slide, please. So talking about what's happening in far North Queensland at this point in time, we're extremely rich. We're rich in natural resources. We've got the reef, we've got the rainforest, we've got all sorts of, in terms of agriculture, in terms of natural resources, we're very rich. But we are also very sensitive to issues of climate change and biodiversity loss. So we are constantly exposed to extreme events like cyclones every year. And that is both a good thing and a bad thing, as I'll talk to you a little later. We have a rich population in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities. They have extremely rich cultures as well as knowledge. We are a very diverse population anyway, just in terms of the culturally and linguistically diverse peoples. We are extremely well connected. I was quite amazed when I came here 10 years ago to find that so many of the organizations work so well together. There's a sense of connection, there's a sense of creativity, and there's a sense of innovation in the area. We have a high focus in terms of agriculture and tourism. And of course, the human services continues to be one of the largest employers in the region. On the other side of the spectrum, we also have high levels of unemployment. We have attendant issues like homelessness. We have significant mental health issues in the region. We have significant issues around domestic violence. We have a number of social issues that also sit within this kind of small scattered populations that we have. One thing that I also noticed was the sense of deprivation. When one lives in Southeast Queensland, the access to funding, the access to resources is so much more than when you come to far North Queensland. I find that things have changed so much in terms of that level of access. And that's something that we need to address too. We also have infrastructure issues that in terms of technology, in terms of roads, in terms of supply chain issues, that continues to be an issue too. And we actually have increased levels of lack of access as we move further out. I live in Cairns. The moment I move into the tablelands, I find levels of access have gone down significantly in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of technology, in terms of just being able to talk to people. At this point in time, with the COVID outbreak, technology has become absolutely central to what we do. And there are so many people who are deprived of access because of infrastructure issues at this point in time. So these are all things that we have to think about at this point in time. Next slide, please. So that sort of brings me to this whole idea of what is happening in COVID-19. Certainly, many of the issues that were already there, issues of homelessness, issues of mental health, issues of domestic violence, financial distress, so many people I met had never gone to Centrelink to actually take social benefits and have had to start taking for the first time in their lives at this point in time because of loss of jobs. There's lack of affordable housing. The rentals are very high in far North Queensland. So in actually being able to access appropriate housing has become a significant issue and continues to get worse. The major tourism and hospitality sectors have been very badly affected at this point in time, and certainly we need to think about how to deal with that too. Technology has become central to what we do. Technology is wonderful. I'm able to talk to you despite that little hiccup at the beginning. We still are able to talk to each other. But there is a digital divide. The divide is on the lines of class in terms of financial capabilities. It's also in terms of skills capabilities, people having the skills to be able to use technology. And finally, it's on regional capabilities that people in the towns have far more access than when we start moving out into the indigenous communities, or we start moving out into all the other little towns and communities outside the cities. There's also a tension. Much of what needs to happen is place-based. It's about responding to the issues of where we are. And yet many of the initiatives that happen tend to happen in the larger context. So it's a statewide response, for example. We had a statewide response on volunteering to deal with the pandemic thing. But what happens then is that people in Brisbane don't know what is going to happen in Cairns. So they might send a volunteer who is in Brisbane and in Cairns, for example, to work in a place like Mossman. These are the kind of things that can happen. So we have to be, that tension has to be challenged too. We also have vulnerable populations, such as older Australians. Particularly, I know in research I've recently done in the tablelands, older Australians are at risk in this particular context because of the isolated nature of where they live, because of the fact that sometimes when a partner dies, they can become homeless, because of lack of access to technology, a whole range of things that put them at risk. Similarly, students, a number of students I know, both international and domestic students, who have been at risk financially and have had to even be subsidized in terms of access to food. Migrant workers who come here to work, what happens to them? People with disabilities, what happens to them in terms of access when volunteers and others who work with them are not able to connect, or not able to reach them because of lockdowns. Similarly, people who are homeless, they don't have technology, they don't have all these kinds of accesses which enable, and even meals can become an issue if the voluntary organizations that provide them with the meals are not able to do so. People with mental health issues, again, people have to be able to get out there, connect, and if one has a mental health issue and is not able to connect, one can be at risk. Now, all of these are very complex issues. And often I find that when there are these kind of issues, people start to think about siloed approaches. If one is homeless, let's try to think of a strategy to deal with homelessness. If there is someone is poor, let's look at getting them better income. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Narayan, I might just jump in there. Just for the benefit of the audience, I will jump in at different times just to make it feel a little bit more like a conversation, I guess. You spoke previously about a sense of resource deprivation in far North Queensland compared to the southeast corner. Those impacts of COVID-19 that you just described, how were they very different from, say, in southeast Queensland, or different at all?
Well, the responses are very different and the access is very different. Many of you who probably live in far North Queensland would recognize the fact that when resources are needed, or when there are place-based responses needed, when people need to get together to actually deal with, say, an issue of homelessness or say an issue of mental health, there needs to be money put into that. Now, money in today's world is largely a product of lobbying, it's largely a product of who knows who, it's a product of so many other factors besides genuine need. And we in far North Queensland are often isolated from these things. I know when I was in Brisbane, it is just a question of going to the minister's office or going to somebody, one of the top level bureaucrats, talking to them, and often getting these things happening. When we are up here, we often are not able to have that level of access. And I think our issues are far more sort of critical because of our lack of access, because of our not being in that. It's always a rollout. If you see anything, including the NBN, it's always a rollout which starts from the center and goes outwards. So we in the regions are in that outside. We tend to get things later than anybody else. So I think there are significant reasons why COVID-19 would have impacted the marginalized groups in far North Queensland far more than Southeast Queensland.
Thanks, Narayan.
So thank you so much, Jack, and do come in whenever you wish and ask questions. So the point I was trying to make is really that if we have complex problems, we need to think in complex ways. So not just in siloed kind of ways, but try to think of processes and products and projects that bring things together, that deal with things at the same, not just the one aspect, but several aspects at the same time. Because if we don't, next slide, please. This is what we're looking at. Largely in today's world, we work on the economic level. We try to increase the level of jobs. We try to increase people's income. But in the process, we're destroying the ecology, we're destroying our social networks, we're destroying our cultural heritage, we're destroying so many other aspects of our lives. And in terms of sustainable development, all these aspects are important to us. Our lives are a product of all of these things. If we lose the other three, the economic by itself means nothing. You can be the richest person in the world and still be extremely unhappy and extremely impoverished because the other things are not there. Because one is lonely, because one is not embedded in culture, because the society around us, the world around us is the ecology and the environment is destroyed. All of these are major factors. Next slide, please. So I like to think of the world much more in this kind of thinking, which is the traditional ideas of sustainable development was the social, the economic, and the ecological. But I think we really need to think about all four, because each of these provides us with a better future. When we build the environment, when we build the ecology around us, when we ensure that we are part of that, we live better lives. When we nurture culture, when we nurture all those processes that are part of culture, we live a better life. If we build our connections, if we build our connection to society, if we build our social capital, we nurture ourselves. And of course, if we build the economic aspect of our life, that too supports the other three. But that four legs of that stool is what is really important, that all four are equally important. Next slide, please. So that brings me to the idea of social enterprise. The idea that this is something that actually provides opportunities for us to work towards the future. Social enterprise basically sits at that intersection, the intersection of the social, the ecological, the cultural, and the economic. All these four it brings together. So we have organizations that are social enterprises that work in that space between the community sector and the corporate sector and work towards satisfying all of these kind of needs. And I'll talk to you about what these kind of social enterprises are. Next slide. So here, if you look at this little diagram that I tried to sort of give that idea, we have community organizations that have traditionally believed in social justice, believed in equity, believed in human rights, believed in ecological sustainability. And these tend to work in particular kinds of ways, often based on grants. On the other side, we have the corporate sector, a corporate sector that is driven by profit, but often has very strong ideas of corporate social responsibility, wanting to give back to the community, wanting to do things in a better way, and often working in quite sort of efficient ways, and as well as working towards economic sustainability. They certainly do ensure that the organizations are sustainable over the long term in the economic sense. The social enterprises draw from both. It draws that efficiency and economic sustainability from the corporate sector, and it draws the ideas of social justice, it draws the idea of human rights, it draws the idea of ecological sustainability from the community sector. Next slide, please. So this is the broad definition of what social enterprises are. Number one, they need to have an economic, social, cultural, or, and I would add, and there too, environmental mission. So it does not have to be just one of these, it can be all of these. So they have a mission that is consistent with the public or community benefit. So it's not just one person dreaming for themselves, but it is also that people working towards something that would benefit the community and the general public too. Second important point is they need to be trading either goods or services to fulfill their mission. So they're actually doing something, selling a product, selling a service to gain income. And that income which comes in is a major part of what they do. And finally, they reinvest a significant portion of this profit or surplus in the fulfillment of their mission. So they fit in that sort of space where they really work towards economic sustainability, but they also work towards building social sustainability, cultural sustainability, or environmental sustainability too. So next slide, please.
Sorry, I might just jump in there, Narayan, before we move on to the next slide. I'm a huge fan of social entrepreneurship. You were talking about their mission there. So would you say that social enterprises would be more effective in achieving their mission than either the private sector or the community sector?
If done well, they probably could. The reason being is that often community organizations struggle because they have only money that comes from particular sources, which is, particularly in Australia, it's largely government. It's either federal, state, or local. So what they do is often driven by what government thinks should be done. Whereas social enterprises have the advantage that they can actually work in spaces where nobody else can often work.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, they are working towards economic sustainability, which means that they can actually start earning money, which they can use to keep themselves going. Again, that gives them an independence, which community organizations don't necessarily have.
That's a good point.
What they do better than the corporate sector is profit-oriented. There's nothing, no two ways about it. So if you are profit-oriented, then what happens to things like the environment, what happens to things like social needs, all of that can get left out in the process. I mean, a good corporate sector organization could be a company that sells guns, for example.
Mm-hmm.
All of these are consistent with what they should be doing. Whereas social enterprises try to do more. However, I would argue that social enterprises need to be crafted very carefully so that they don't get stuck in just one economic thing or one cultural thing or one environmental thing, but actually work across all these spaces.
Mm-hmm. That's a great answer. Thank you.
So I thought I'll share some of the ideas that I had in terms of what social enterprises can do and are doing at this point in time. Housing is an area that I'm particularly familiar with because some of my recent research has been in that area around looking at what's happening in the tablelands, in Mariba and the tablelands area in terms of crisis housing. And while I was doing that, I came across some really good examples across Australia of organizations that work in this space. Particularly in the post-COVID area sort of arena, we have to start thinking about this. I mean, the opportunities are there. For example, doing building, if we can build more social housing or low-cost rentals, but in the process, we also build wraparound services that will enable the people who live there to get better incomes, to get trained, to be able to manage their tenancies, to be able to keep the tenancies, to be able to survive in what is quite a harsh world at this point in time. Good examples are organizations like Common Ground, which are set up in Brisbane and other places in Australia. There are also real estate agencies. There's significant opportunities for real estate agents to work as social enterprises where they can provide housing that is below market prices. I know social enterprises where they actually ensure that the rent paid is never more than 30% of the family income. So the family is actually not being impoverished by the housing that they live in. And this can work really closely with many of us who are people who care and perhaps would like to invest in these kind of places. So angel investors, as they're called, would probably invest in housing, which these real estates would then provide to below market rentals. So in our region, for example, we've got the Mariba community housing that provides this kind of resource. And one of the good things about setting up these kind of agencies is that the profits can be turned into property which sort of supports low-income people. So there's numbers of them. There's PIRE, which is uses profits from their real estate business to build safe and permanent housing, which is provided to, I think, over more than 200 women and children live in their housing, and they pay rent, but never more than 30% of their household needs. Similarly, we can do building projects such as co-housing, where you have shared spaces as well as individual housing. Sorry, my voice is not at its best. I do apologize. So it's like the old cooperatives. The idea is people come together in numbers, they can build houses together. And I think in far North Queensland, there's lots of opportunity for this, especially people who are single, also couples who can come together and build co-housing. And even the building itself can be done with marginalized communities being part of that building process and learning skills in the process. I know there has been discussion about prisoners coming out of Lotus Glen who can sort of look at getting trained. Often they have difficulty in getting jobs because they have been to prison. So whether these kind of places can be used to develop apprenticeships where people can get training and move on from there. Also specialized housing for people with disabilities. I know organizations that are already doing this. Particularly older Australians with disabilities requires different kinds of houses, different kinds. Even the kitchen bench often has to be a different height. So developing specialized kind of houses. There's other opportunities for even temporary housing. There's lots of government land around, but which doesn't necessarily, nobody necessarily wants to move it into the private sector. But temporarily, for people who are homeless, one could provide modular housing, which could sit on this land and then be taken away when there is no need. And there's already sort of examples of this. For example, Harris Transportable Housing, which is in Victoria, which provides this kind of housing on Vic Road's land. So there are all these kind of opportunities. Similarly, in health, we have Couch Wellness, which, for example, which provides services to people who are living with cancer, and holistic treatment, which includes things like yoga and other kinds of treatments too. There's a wonderful opportunity. I won't go through all of these, but I think there's one also in terms of moving a lot of the expert-based mental health, which happens in cities, into communities. So for example, in many of the communities that are further north than us, I think particularly in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, there is opportunity for moving health services into the community, training health workers in the local area to actually do this kind of work, where things like cognitive behavior therapy and others could be taught to local workers. This has already been done on very wide scales internationally. Countries like India, Nigeria, Afghanistan, and others have already done these kind of projects across millions of people, and it's worked really well. So there's opportunities for doing these kind of things in a way that helps the community as well as develop skills for individuals within the community too. There are a number of possibilities there in terms of health. Next slide, please.
Narayan, I might just jump in. We had a question from Bernadine in the audience.
Yes.
You've mentioned a couple of examples there of social enterprises, and like you say, you can go on and on forever, but is there some sort of social enterprise directory or forum or something like that where people might be able to get an idea of the range of social enterprises already in existence?
There's no one directory at the moment, but there are lots of organizations trying to put those together. And certainly, I hope that at least for Far North Queensland, we should have one in place by the end of this year. Mm-hmm. I will be giving you the link to the Social Enterprise Network. So we will be having these kind of resources available to you later through this year.
That's perfect.
Thank you. So there are other possibilities. I mean, we already have, this is probably an area of small business where lots of social enterprises exist. Things like running laundries, cleaning services, plant nurseries, garden services, cafes, and all of these are good in different ways. Number one, they provide a product, but number two, they provide training. So people who are marginalized, such as humanitarian entrants to Australia, such as people with disabilities. I know, for example, Green Care, which does a bit of my garden, is an organization that's a social enterprise that is for people with mental health issues or disabilities. And they get training and they get income through this process. Similarly, you have Orange Sky Laundry, which provides services to the homeless and also provides training and income that comes into that process too. Technology is something that I really think is going to be extremely important for Far North Queensland. We are very poorly connected at this point in time. And I think we need to start looking at new ways of connection, perhaps through satellite connectivity or through provision of local Wi-Fi connectivity. But the actual building of social enterprises around providing digital connectivity is an opportunity for the future. But besides that, I mean, there are opportunities for digital fabrication, portals that bring people together around particular issues like mental health or physical health, online marketing. There are so many creative products in Far North Queensland. Selling these products, supporting artisans, local artisans, these are all opportunities in terms of marketing. E-waste recycling, there's plenty of opportunity there. I know there are companies already doing plastic recycling, but I think there's many more opportunities there. Eco-villages, this is happening across the world, and I think Far North Queensland, amazing opportunities there too. Yarrabah is one great example. I mean, it's close to Cairns. If the connectivity is improved to Yarrabah, possibly that there could be something that could be built around it. I'm a little hesitant with the eco-village idea because often it just becomes a show. It's not about true understanding of culture. It's not, so it has to be done very carefully in a way that the people carry the whole process, and it benefits everybody in the community. Renewables, in terms of what's happening in solar, in terms of what's happening with wind, are there opportunities there too? With what's happening with biogas, all of these are opportunities too. Education is opportunities in terms of what is a lot of, I'm most impressed with the young people in schools. Over the last year, I've interacted quite a few with a lot of young people, and they are full of ideas and they're full of entrepreneurship, and not just entrepreneurship as in corporate entrepreneurship, but wanting to do good, wanting to make a difference. And I think there's opportunity to build that in schools itself, either through their own projects or through training them in developing their skills towards bringing that in the future. Next slide, please. So I thought I'll introduce some of the research that we're doing at this point in time with social enterprises as well as policymakers and others. And certainly one of the things that's come out is that COVID-19 is the catalyst for positive change. There's numerous opportunities that are coming out of this in terms of technology, in terms of sustainability, and also in terms of building options that are locality based. Because of lockdowns and other things that happen, we certainly have become much more aware of the fact that we cannot always be global. We also need to be local. And this has certainly made that very, very important. There are opportunities which I've spoken about in social housing, low-cost rentals, technology upgrades, reskilling, portal development, health-based social enterprises. I've spoken about some of that. And if we have time at the end, we can talk some more about it. The important thing is that Far North Queensland is used to disasters. We're used to dealing with these, and we have built up our resilience and our coping skills. So we can go forwards quite easily. We provide the opportunities to pilot, pivot, or scale up social enterprises, which can be replicated elsewhere. And this is a quote from one of the interviewees. Certainly, we are providing responses to problems that government and private enterprise cannot provide. So those gaps between what happens in the community sector and what happens in private enterprise can be filled. Keeping young people in the region. This is an important part of what needs to happen. And by actually making them the ones who guide the process, who actually set up social enterprises, there's huge opportunities for us to ensure that young people stay in the region. And of course, by encouraging social entrepreneurs to come here, I mean, this is a great example is Noosa, where by getting entrepreneurs in general to go there, they were able to build up the community there. Similarly, I think in Far North Queensland, given our natural resources, the way that people love it when they come here, we can actually encourage more social entrepreneurs to come into the region. Next slide, please.
Narayan, I'll just jump in there with a really good question, a couple of questions from the audience. Where would social enterprises get their initial sort of seed funding from, and what proportion of their income would a social enterprise be expected to earn from trade?
Well, the social enterprise part of it, largely the major proportion, so which means at least 50%, should be from trade. But and that's why, for example, it's more about building those boundaries. So when a community organization, for example, was largely doing, running on grants, runs a social enterprise, they need to make sure that their books are separate. They may need to make sure that that social enterprise part is shown independent from the rest of what they're doing. Then it becomes a social enterprise. So certainly a significant part should be from the service. And this, of course, changes with time. When people start, you're not going to get that much income. But as you go on, you're expected to have a business plan that will enable you to start bringing that kind of income in. In terms of where you're getting the money from, there's everything from impact investments, like even banks give, when they want to make an impact, they can actually provide funding. You have initial grants, you have angel investors who are people who want to do good. You got sweat equity, which is basically a term to say you do the work. So people just put in their own effort and build social enterprises with that, volunteer their time. But similarly, now there's modern funding arrangements like crowdfunding. I know a social enterprise down in Brisbane, which pretty much bought they basically were providing a place for farmers to sell their products. And by crowdfunding, they got more than $1.3 million, which they were able to invest in the warehouse in which now they continue their business. So there's those kind of opportunities too. If you're doing something good and can tell a good story, you can actually get funding from all sorts of locations at this point in time.
Definitely the way of the future then.
Absolutely. But again, it's not the answer to everything. It's one answer. You've got the corporate sector does its own thing, the community sector does its own thing, and social enterprise too does its own thing. Then they can work together. So it certainly provides all these opportunities to reskill people. For example, hospitality has been hugely hit at this point in time.
Mm-hmm.
But things like the NDIS, for example, can provide opportunities to train up people who can work in the NDIS system and provide care. So perhaps we need to be able to move people across too. But some of the gaps that people have identified is in business skills or education on how to run businesses, particularly within the NGO sector. That is a gap that people feel. Gap in investment. Now, goes back to your question. Many people have said that, look, we need to bring the investors here. They need to see what's happening here. And so again, it goes back to your earlier question, the fact that all the investors are often down in Southeast Queensland or in Sydney or in Melbourne. So bringing them here, and that was something we had actually planned to do this year, but with COVID, we haven't been able to. We actually wanted to bring groups of investors here, take them around to the social enterprises, film a documentary of them traveling around. But unfortunately, that couldn't happen. But it will happen sometime, maybe next year. But yes, investors need to see the wonderful things that are happening here.
Definitely.
Also,
and also, sorry, Narayan, I'll just interrupt again. Melissa has a question now, which is very similar to what we've been talking about. But how can an organisation link to the angel investors that you've spoken about? Are these micro loans? How, I suppose, some go forwards or some steps forwards for people that might be interested in starting a social enterprise?
Yes, certainly. At this point in time, unfortunately, it's about getting to places like Brisbane and attending a lot of the forums that happen there, because when I go there and I meet so many more angel investors than I meet here. So when we have the, say, for example, a unconference or a social enterprise council conference there, we tend to meet a lot of people who are interested. So a little bit of mobility is perhaps needed at this point in time. But for the future, I'm hoping that we can bring the investors here. We can actually do things that bring investors here. The other option is perhaps we could also look at organizing something like this, not a webinar or a summit, bringing together investors and people with ideas and getting them to, this is something we have discussed at GCU as to how this could be a possibility for the future too. But certainly there is opportunity there. There are a number of people there are these kind of investors. I have met several of them over the last few years. And I think there's opportunity there for Far North Queensland. Again, because we get stuck in our little world and can't connect with them, we often lose out on great ideas. So I think there's opportunity to use now technology as well as physical movement to try and bring people into that space here.
Excellent. Well, we've only got 10 minutes left, Narayan, so I'll leave it over to you now to...
All right, next slide, please. So yes, seed funding. Also scaling up, these kind of things are needed. There is a significant lack of awareness about social enterprises at local, state, and federal government. The state government, fortunately, has got really onto the ball over the last year, and they're doing lots of things. They brought out a policy on this. So certainly things are happening. But I think largely, again, the research shows that a lot of people in the space need to know more about this. Also, the idea of sharing, that people who are interested in social enterprises, as well as people with ideas, as well as others, need to come together. The idea of using an online space, and this is something that we are looking at, and probably if you go to the next slide, I can talk about this a little bit more. So over the last 2 years, I've been working on with a number of colleagues in terms of bringing together the social enterprise network for the Tropics. We've clearly listed it as a Tropics so that it's focused on our issues. It's focused on issues that we have in common with Northern Territory, for example. And that with that sense of isolation, that sense of regionalism, that sense of and having significant indigenous communities, what can happen in these spaces is quite different from the rest of the country. So we've launched it a year ago, and we're really looking at a number of things, events and stuff which we've already done. And we are looking at another one in August, where we're looking at a summit for Northern Australia. Again, it'll probably be virtual, but again, bringing together lots of people, lots of ideas, having that space where people can talk to each other. And in the next slide, this is the website. So it's centfnq.com.au. If you actually go to the site, you can register either as a member or just to connect so that you get the newsletter. We are working towards, in the next couple of months, to actually develop part of it as that online portal where people can talk to each other. People can bounce ideas off each other, and where people can perhaps look for ideas like funding. Where is the funding available? Who can they talk to? And that's certainly something we'll be looking at. Hopefully, we'll get a bit of money to do that in the next month or so. So certainly we'll be looking at that. And so I encourage any of you interested to join at CentFNQ. And so finally, next slide, please. So that's the Sense link. If you want to look at my publications, so my publications are more than social enterprise. There are lots of things on mental health and community development, but you can go to ResearchGate or to JCU and have a look at my publications too there. And finally, the last slide. Just to thank you all, another lovely picture from Vietnam, actually. But I'm a people person. I really like to see people when I'm talking. So I do apologize if I haven't been able to convey my belief in many of the things that I've been talking about. But I really do believe that if we work together around social enterprise in far North Queensland, we can actually make a difference and get past some of the things that have happened to us through the pandemic and actually build a more resilient and sustainable future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Narayan. That was a wonderful presentation. I think you're spot on. I think the feeling around society is that social enterprise could be a wonderful way to sort of recalibrate people's thinking in the business world. So once again, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. That's not just me saying that. There's plenty of people in the audience that have expressed an interest in Cent as well. So that's great. So thank you to all the people in the audience who tuned in tonight and sent through your questions. We would really appreciate your feedback so that we can continue to deliver interesting and engaging webinars throughout the rest of this series. So as such, if you wouldn't mind sparing some time to complete our feedback survey, that'll be fantastic. So a link should appear once the webinar concludes. The date for our next webinar is the 9th of July, and we'll be exploring the legal impact of COVID-19 on businesses and jobs with Dr. Louise Floyd. However, for now, it's thank you and good night.